Hello. So this is an impromptu video, and I know it's been a few months, but um, today I wanted to say a few words on what your Linux experience is going to be like if you're new. Okay, let's say you've used Windows your whole life and you're just now switching to something like Ubuntu or Linux Mint or one of the recommended distros. It could be Fedora, something user friendly, right? So um, let's start let's jump right into it. So, for example, people say that uh, there are beginner distros and there's like advanced distros, and this is true. So, some of them will be simply easier to comprehend, and some of them will kind of expect you to know how Linux works. And if you haven't even had experience like typing commands in the terminal, like cd or ls or something, just basic things like that, then it's going to be really difficult for you to like install something like Arch Linux, right? Where you have to know all these things. And even though the Arch Wiki is extremely helpful, it's not something to consider as your first distro. So you should pick something from the beginner list. So there's a few recommendations that I would make personally, and there's the best one that I would recommend. So you don't even have to think about it. I know Chris Titus made a video where he basically boiled down all the distros to three general major ones. I think it was like Fedora and like Debian and Arch basically are your three top choices. And you could put something like OpenSUSE in the Fedora category, and basically you have three, I don't know, schools of thought or something. But the I will first give three or two recommendations, and I'll say which one I like better. Okay, so there's Popos, or let's say three. Okay, so there's Popos, Linux Mint, and Ubuntu. Okay, what unites them all is that they're based on Ubuntu, and really when you don't even know how your system is going to function really, and you're just kind of jumping into it, like you might have seen some videos, but the experience is really different from just watching someone use the system, right? So for example, Pop! OS is famous for their NVIDIA driver integration. So if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, downloading Pop! OS with the NVIDIA drivers baked in will be better, basically, than just installing Ubuntu and then finding those drivers, right? But they also have their own kind of flavor, and I don't know, they try to make it seem user friendly, but I'm personally not a fan of the look. However, a good thing that they do make is called the Popshell. And the Popshell is kind of a way, when you open one window, right, it automatically fills in the whole screen area. When you open two windows, it'll put both windows side by side, filling up all the space. It's something that's more common on Linux. Windows has a way to do that, but it's not really known. And because the Windows user base is so large, it's kind of hard to find. It's not like you're going to be lurking in like Windows Enjoyers forum and find this stuff. It's more of a Unix type of thing called tiling window managers, which is like if you've ever seen those computers that look like horridly like complicated, like they have and they have like really low res like fonts and very minimalistic looking, almost like a terminal from the 70s or something, and people are using this somehow without a mouse. That would be like using a tiling window manager, essentially. And the best thing about tiling window managers, like the only thing that's really worthwhile, like the only function, is the fact that it tiles windows automatically for you. So you don't, like, it's rare for you to have to drag the screens to the side. Like, when you tile stuff, you take the title bar and you drag it to the side, and then it snaps to the corner or the side of the screen, right? So Pop! OS has this thing called the Popshell that you can install as an extension on Ubuntu as well. Um, and it basically tiles the windows, but everything else is the same. You have the nice like GNOME user experience, I guess, which is the default on Pop! OS and Ubuntu. So if you see how Ubuntu looks, that's basically the GNOME desktop, and you can install Pop! OS shell on Pop! OS or on Ubuntu. So it doesn't really make sense to use something that's based on Ubuntu but is so close to the upstream, just like Linux Mint. Like, it makes things nice, and it may even be a point for Linux Mint that it looks more Windows-like, for example. But then it gives you three options of desktop environment. There's the main one, which is probably the best, but also just the fact that Ubuntu has the Ask Ubuntu forums and has the biggest user base in terms of any Linux distro, period, that is the one that I would go with. And that's the one that I did go with because I've heard of the name Ubuntu. If people have heard of Linux, the only distro they've probably heard of is Ubuntu, right? So that just shows you how popular it is and how many resources there are for it. And that is important because when you start using Linux, no matter how beginner friendly your distro is, you'll have to sort of learn how how Unix-like systems work, or how Linux works. Alternatively, so for example, the Popshell, if you're going to be using that on Ubuntu, you'll have to follow a set of commands in the terminal to install it instead of like using some graphical thing because it's not in the software store in Ubuntu. It's like a separate thing that you have to install manually. Let's say that. So what I want to say here is don't be afraid to use the terminal. No matter how beginner friendly a distro may seem, like something like Deepin, where it's like super cute and Apple-like and it's all candy styled and you want to lick the menus and the icons are so shiny and it's like a Fisher-Price toy or something. At the end of the day, those are just more layers of abstraction, making it harder to see what's really in your system, right? And that's why seasoned Linux veterans, the more they kind of experience Linux, the less they care about the outside and how things look on the outside, because when you use the terminal, and you will have to at some point or another maybe to fix something, or I don't know, just like in Windows when you have to fix something like specific, you may have to use the PowerShell, but it's really simple when you can just copy and paste a command, which you shouldn't do without like thinking about it. Like, you kind of gotta read and be like, oh, okay, this one does that, this part does that. It doesn't say like remove all my files or something obviously like nefarious like that. It's like, oh, okay, well, this I kind of like begin to understand what this does, and then you would copy it. So yeah, even on Windows you have to use the PowerShell because it's unavoidable that in computers the best way to do something, the most straightforward way, is the terminal. So just like I think Luke Smith talked about this, when you use Linux, abstracting the user away from the terminal just means they will reach that point at a later date, which I suppose is good for new users, but you should just keep in mind that don't be scared of the terminal. It's literally like using Siri, I guess, but you type commands instead of saying stuff, and you just have to know what to say, like abracadabra. It's like Harry Potter or something. You say a specific spell, right, or whatever, and the terminal does what you want, okay? And you can combine spells and stuff like that. You don't even have to learn all that, but sometimes basic commands won't just work, whereas all these graphical tools and stuff like that, they'll be wonky, okay? It's just a layer of abstraction away from how the computer really functions. So and the fact that you're interested in Linux, that you're watching this video, means you already have some degree of curiosity to be like, okay, well, let's peek behind the curtain. Let's try something that gives me user freedom. And Linux is all about freedom, right? So all the components that a distro may be out of, there's a bunch. Okay, there's the stuff that runs the audio, there's the stuff that runs the way your windows look, a ton of other stuff, right? It's all combined together, weave together, and that is freedom. So you wouldn't expect something like an integrated thing like with Windows or something, an Xbox or whatever, like, oh, Xbox Game Bar or Apple AirDrop or something. There are great apps for all these separate functionalities, but you have the freedom to pick the apps you like. So you aren't just stuck with the like Ubuntu's implementation of something, okay? For example, there's a very robust program called KDE Connect. You install it on your Android phone, and I believe they're trying to make it for Windows and for Apple phones as well, but I don't know how long that's going to take. So let's say it's just for Android phones. Android phones are more free, so it makes sense. Linux, Android. Android is based on Linux vaguely. So, yeah, the KDE Connect app, you install it on the phone, you install the desktop app on the desktop, and it allows you to do more stuff that you can do with AirDrop, okay? But you have to install it yourself. You have to make the choice to be like, I want this implemented in my OS. And some of them come with KDE Connect by default. Like KDE is a huge organization that makes the K desktop environment. It's like it makes your computer look totally different if you don't know what a desktop environment is. Like all the buttons and where things are placed and the way things are drawn, it's all different. That's a desktop environment basically. So GNOME is the typical one, GNOME, used on Ubuntu and Pop OS, and basically the most popular distros, and it's the most common desktop environment for Linux. But there's also KDE, and they make their own apps, and GNOME makes their own apps, and they still work with each other, even though KDE makes apps that are geared towards the K desktop environment, and GNOME makes apps that are geared for the GNOME desktop environment. You can use KDE apps in GNOME and vice versa. So, essentially, a distro is just a pre-built kind of set of components. And so the reason why Ubuntu is so popular is because they pick kind of the easiest to just click around components instead of picking something like Harden that like a Linux veteran would use, okay? And this is why I would also mention this. People will say that, okay, this distro is super easy to use and it just works. And I installed it for a friend and he hasn't used it much yet, but after also customizing it for him to look like Mac OS, which is kind of what I like, he basically says, yeah, like I get it, you know? Um, but for me, for example, while I did get adjusted to like the menus and stuff, I didn't even know what I wanted from the theming, right? It took me months to kind of like understand, like, oh, okay, I can add extensions that can show different things on my top bar, or I could install a extension that'll have the dock, like in Mac OS, on the bottom or on the side, or I could remove this, and you have to get used to things being modular. So it's like, it's almost like when Windows doesn't give you a choice, in a way that's user friendly because you don't have to think about it, but ultimately you find your own voice in Linux. So at first you might start out with something user friendly like Ubuntu, but then you're like, oh, I actually like Arch, and I'm okay with stuff being more likely to break and it being not as like set up by default. I am still on Ubuntu after over a year. I started using Linux last August or July, maybe, just kind of getting into it, but now after a year, like I'm familiar with Linux. I'm totally comfortable with it, and I think I know like a good amount for a user, right? Just to like use stuff and write commands and shell scripts and stuff like that. I could do all that, and that's not even necessary for a user, right? It's just Linux encourages you to learn easier ways to do things, basically. So when you see this kind of different workflow on Linux, don't be afraid to, you know, like see how it goes, give into it a little bit. You have to be open-minded, and yes, the fact that you're watching this video means you're at least thinking about trying it, right? Many people will say like, oh, Linux, no, that's too different. I don't know, it's too different, I don't want to use it. I don't want to have to learn new stuff or whatever, right? Because you want to learn new stuff, you are maybe open-minded enough to try Linux, and you should, whether or not, yeah, how open-minded you think you are. I think if you stick with it for, I don't know, a month or so, you'll start to get it, and you will enjoy it, I think, more than something locked down like Windows or the Mac OS. So, what else can I say here? Yeah, you will run into issues because, or if you are the type to kind of experiment and poke around, right? So any system you start modifying and be like, what does this do and what does that do? you end up leaving like a bunch of kind of dirt behind, because it's like people with their project car or something. People will be like, oh, I'm gonna change the pipe on here, or I don't know, I'm not a car guy, but I'll change like this part and make it look more like that, or I'm gonna make the engine stick out or something like that. um, if you use your main computer as that kind of Frankenstein to experiment with Linux and learn more about by poking around, which is the best way to learn. If you want to learn how Linux works and get really comfortable and do things more efficiently than ever before, you will have to kind of poke around and be curious, about stuff. Be prepared to, you need to kind of have a stoic philosophy about it, I guess. When something breaks, don't fault the system, right? The system is, I guess, designed for you not to really change it much, right? It's like this distro is built in a certain way, and that's how they expect you to use it. And so you will have the best success if you just use it how it's made. But the nature of Linux is also one of modular components, extensibility, freedom, and stuff like that. So when you install various extensions, or this website says do this, but you don't really understand how it works and you're just following a guide, and then suddenly, let's say like something doesn't work, like your top panel is missing or whatever, don't freak out. You're probably not the first person who's run into the issue, and that's why the Ask Ubuntu forums exist. For example, I have a folder of fixes that I commonly may need to do when reinstalling a system, right? Which you don't even have to do. I just like to do it for cleanliness, and I also would mess around and be like, oh, I'm gonna install Arch Linux on my main system. It's the summer, I don't have anything to do. I'll just do that, and I basically had like unlimited free time. So let me maybe read some of the favorited bookmarks that I have for Linux fixes, because I have a pretty extensive Linux folder at this point. I have a bunch of guides. Like, for example, at one point I owned an iPhone and I wanted to see how to mount it, right? And so I have a bookmark here that says how to mount your iPhone as an external drive in Ubuntu, okay? If you have any issue, you can look up Ubuntu, or maybe read the error message, which is kind of also a skill you need to learn. If you're going to mess around with your system, you might get an error message and you need to read and like kind of parse what it says, right? So for example, this guide that I have bookmarked, it just says essentially you install a package, which is like an app, I guess, by writing a few words in the terminal, and then you use a command. This, for example, is iDevice pair, and then you will pair it with your iPhone and stuff like that. And basically it works. So you just follow step-by-step stuff and it'll work. And that's for specific issues, right? So it's not like you will have to mount an iPhone in 100% of the cases. Maybe you don't even need to do that. Or maybe you could lay it off for another time. Or maybe you don't own an iPhone. So for example, another one here I have is, for example, I use a VPN with all my stuff, and me being a privacy-focused individual means I have more requirements, I guess, from an operating system. So in my case, I wanted to make things simpler, right? One thing about Linux also is making things simpler, making things function automatically and stuff like that, and using your computer to the fullest extent to be the most efficient. So I have one where it'll automatically turn on my VPN when I unlock my system, when I boot into my system and then type in my password, and it unlocks the desktop. So that's just a guide I have, and I have it in the fixes folder so that when I reinstall Ubuntu, I can just follow this guide and be like, okay, I have my thing set up. You just have to, it's all actually graphical. All you have to do is in the terminal is just write a command to open an app that's not in your general apps where it says show all apps. It's kind of like a hidden app because it's sort of outdated, but you can still use it. And that's the thing. Things on Linux will work for decades, okay? There are books about Unix from the 70s about basic commands that'll still work the same way on modern Linux systems. So it's very stable, it's very extensible. For example, one thing I also learned to do is to write basic shell scripts. And a shell script, it sounds scary, right? But all it is just basically a chain of commands that you would type in the terminal one by one, but just all together in a file. You run the file, it gives the computer all those commands in that order. So I literally have a script that'll reinstall all my favorite apps, set up the icons the way I like it, set up the theme. You could, download a custom theme for GNOME and install it, and it'll make your desktop look kind of different. And it basically configures my desktop exactly the way I like it. Okay, so these are some things that you can do if you are open-minded enough to learn it. But with distros like Ubuntu, you don't even have to kind of want to learn it. You can just use Ubuntu the way it's made, and it's supposed to be user-friendly, and you can even use the graphical software store just like in Mac OS or like the Windows Store, for example, and just install apps from there and it'll work. So, yeah. Or if you're having trouble installing something or you can't find something in the software store, then you would look up how to install blank on Ubuntu, and it'll be like, okay, you have to add this repository, which is just 2 commands, and then you install the thing. You just type sudo apt install and then the name of the thing that you want to install. So things like that are just basic like things that you'll probably have to learn to kind of like navigate your way through installing apps that you won't find in the store. So that's like something that is not there by default, but you just follow a guide online. It tells you how to do everything. And most of the stuff you want will probably be in the software store. For example, there's Steam in the software store. There's Discord. There's a lot of things. And Ubuntu is trying to make things easier by having their own format of a package that they can, of a app, basically, their own app format called Snap, basically. And it kind of makes things easier for new people. So it allows like a bunch of people to add apps that aren't necessarily as rigorously reviewed as the general apt package apps. So I know that's confusing, but basically it means that Ubuntu is getting more and more apps of things that you would commonly use on Windows, like, I don't know, Spotify or something, or Google Chrome, and things like that. So most of the stuff you'll be able to install. And for some things, like if you're worried about video editing, I used Vegas Pro for a while. I remember using Windows Movie Maker, all these things. If I switched to Linux back then, I would be like, where's Windows Movie Maker? Or where's Vegas Pro? And all these things. How do I install Vegas Pro? And the thing is, Linux is a different operating system, and you will install different things, right? Just like Apple, for example, prefers their own apps, like iMovie or whatever, over Windows Movie Maker that you would have to install like in a virtual machine on Mac OS or something like that. Linux also has their own editing apps. There's OpenShot. There's basically there's plenty of options, and there are best ones and not so good ones, and you have the freedom to choose whichever one you prefer. Kdenlive is a standard, very robust application that is essentially like Vegas Pro. Okay, the workflow might be a little different, but that's something you get used to. Expect the unexpected. Essentially, you are treading on new territory, and don't expect things to work the same way as they've always worked. It's a different system. It's like someone switching from Windows to Mac OS, or vice versa, or from Android to iPhone. Things are different, but the principles are the same. It is a computer, so don't be scared of not knowing. It'll all come to you, and with using a beginner-friendly distro, it'll be even easier. So I would just install Ubuntu if I were you, play around, see what apps it has, and I mean the best way if you're running Windows is to dual boot. There's a way to do that automatically in the Ubuntu installer. You don't have to worry about it. Just click on the option where it says install alongside Windows Boot Manager. And then when your computer launches, you will have a selection whether you want Ubuntu or Windows. And over time, I think you'll learn that you can do everything that you want on Linux, unless you have some very specific task or a specific filter that you need to do in Photoshop and you're like a professional, the vast majority of people can use Linux without an issue or without missing anything. Like, for example, I have Zoom installed for school. You can install Teams. You can install all the proprietary software you need for school, and you'll be perfectly fine. The only things that may not work are specific, high grade, kind of like professional level software, like, I don't know, Maya or something, or Adobe Premiere, which you could probably still run, but at that point, you might just want to have a workhorse of a computer that is separate for your work and do everything else on Linux. Because Linux gives you the freedom that no other operating system can besides, you know, the free and open source ones like BSD. So, yeah, that's my I guess, advice to you from someone who had to go through, I guess, the trials and tribulations myself. Things are not so hard, and if you really have some kind of issue and you can't figure it out by, looking it up online, you can just leave a comment on this video and I'll probably help you, because I have a whole folder here of about 30 things that, have had to fix at some point in Linux, and at this point I am somewhat experienced with, editing system configuration and stuff like that. So if you have a peculiar issue that you can't find the solution to online, just leave a comment under this video and I'll help you. So that's about all. Thanks for watching.